Greetings and salutations! I hope this video finds you well. I am going to respond to some very clickbait journalism in this video, and therefore I may be accused of perpetuating clickbait journalism. Ordinarily, I would completely avoid stuff like this. However, this is a subject that is very near and dear to my heart, and I have very strong opinions on it. So yes, dear viewer, this video is going to be a rant because this pissed me off. I'm going to tell you straight up. Now, I do not want this video to be seen by anybody as me calling anybody out. I don't want it to be seen as me trying to stir the pot or start a flame war or anything like that. But sooner or later, if you feel strongly about something, you have to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, that's enough. Let's talk about this for a minute. That's what I'm doing. I am exercising my right to free speech. So, what is this all about? An article appeared in Tech Republic just a few days ago by a fellow named James Saunders. I have skimmed through the article. I don't know anything about James, and I don't really follow his work, so this is not an attack on James. However, he posted an article with a headline that reads, Scientific Linux and Antergos are shutting down. It's time for Linux Mint to go. The YouTuber DistroTube has included this story in his video series called Taking Into Account. Now, I have been following DistroTube for quite some time, and I generally enjoy his content, even if I don't agree with everything that he says in his videos. But he decided that he would report on this, and in the title for his video, he went a step further and said Linux Mint must die. Now, I don't respond to people on YouTube. I don't call out YouTubers. I don't hardly ever talk about other YouTube channels. And the reason why is because it's a professional courtesy thing. It comes from my days of working in radio and television. If you work for one radio station and you have a competing radio station across town, you don't say bad things about them on the air, because then people might accuse you of being a spoiled sport or a bad sportsmanship, whatever. You don't say good things about them on the air simply because of the fact that that's giving them free publicity. And if they're competing with you, why would you do that? So as we roll along in this video, I want you to understand a very important concept of marketing and broadcasting. There is no such thing as bad publicity. Even if somebody jumps up and points a finger at you and says, hey, you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. If they do it in the right place at the right time, it will forward your cause, because everybody's going to come tune in your radio station, or they're going to click on your YouTube channel or read your blog or whatever. And that's part of what clickbait is really all about. That's why you do it. You're trying to stir the pot. You're trying to piss people off. And unfortunately, all media creators in this highly competitive YouTube blogosphere environment are guilty of it at one point or another. I've done it. Everybody's done it, because you're just like, God, I just need somebody to click on this. I need to get a video out. I want people to talk about my channel. I want to be a part of this community. And sometimes you put things up that you go and you stop and think about it later. You go, that's kind of, I don't know whether I should have done that. I don't want what I say in this video to be seen as an attack on DistroTube or Mr. Saunders at Tech Republic. They're just doing what they do. I am talking about the subject matter. I am talking about the opinions they expressed, not the people. So let's make sure that it's understood. Basically, what DistroTube said was, in his video, and what Saunders had said in his article, and DistroTube went on with it, is that he does not see the point in Linux Mint. He finds it to be completely redundant. He thinks that it's a subpar distro. He pointed out mistakes that have been made, security breaches that have happened in the past, reasons why all the Linux Mint developers who currently work on, let's say, a direct quote here, if you work on the XFCE desktop for Linux Mint, you should quit what you're doing and go work on Ubuntu, that it's nothing more than a duplication of effort, and that it shouldn't exist. Well, it shows me that DistroTube and James Saunders have a profound ignorance when it comes to what Linux Mint is about and who are the people who use Linux Mint, because it's not them. Linux Mint has done more to bring new users to Linux than any other Linux distribution out there. Whether you like it or not, whether you use it or not, you should be supporting Linux Mint. You should be helping the project because it provides a gateway to Linux like no other. And it's the reason why when people ask me, what Linux distribution should I start out with, I always say Linux Mint. Sometimes I'll tell them, hey, you could use Ubuntu Mate, but it depends on the user. I have discussed that in the past in my videos, why I feel that way. Linux Mint provides the most polished, complete Linux experience when you install it than any other. Once you get it installed, you've got one of everything that works. Proven software. They have dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's. If you check the box that says install third-party software during installation, you get everything you're going to need. You also have installed, when Linux Mint is done installing, this is just the installer, you have an entire build environment so that you can start creating software and building it from source code yourself if that's something that you want to do. It's pre-installed with Linux Mint. All of the codecs are already there. You don't have to think twice about it. You will never in Linux Mint click on a file and have it come up where it says, I can't play this, because all of the codecs are already there. No other distribution of Linux, not one, provides that kind of polished experience. None of them. Not Manjaro, not Ubuntu Mate, none of them. Sometimes I will tell people, hey, you would be more suited to get started with Ubuntu Mate. And those people tend to be the ones who are more hands-on. They want to have some stake in what's going on with their computer, and they're just those kind of users. You know, I can always tell. Like my brother, for instance, great example. He knows his way around a computer. He's very computer savvy. Way back in the 80s, he was working on these big Unix systems that had paraphernalia that took up entire rooms. He understands the system. So I said, here, you'll like this. Guess what? He did. Because it's very easy to set up Ubuntu Mate. It's pretty much all point and click, but it is a process. You have to go and install your codecs, and you have to go do this and go do that, and you make decisions along the way. Linux Mint, bam, it's there. It just works. Linux Mint does not exist to please Linux elitists. It exists to make Linux easy to use for people who don't give two shits about Linux. It exists for people who are not computer geeks. It exists for people who are just profoundly lazy, even if they do understand how the system works, and they want to spin up something that is a full-featured environment, and there it is. The Cinnamon desktop environment, the XFCE desktop environment, and the Mate desktop environment, which is what they ship with, are all set up in the same way to mimic the old Windows 7 paradigm. There are those in Linux who use it for aesthetic purposes. They like the way a GNOME desktop works. They like the way other alternative desktops to the old Windows Start menu setup. They like that. That's why they're here. There's nothing wrong with that. But you need to understand that people who are coming to Linux from Windows find those desktop environments to be intimidating. Very much so. They don't know where everything is. The Linux Mint team, with the development of Cinnamon and the way they theme XFCE and the way they theme their Mate desktop, have created an environment that feels very familiar to these people who are coming from the Windows world. And when they sit down and start using it, they know intuitively where things are. Things show up where they expect them to be. That is extremely important, because people who even are curious about Linux are intimidated by what they see in Linux as being unnecessarily cryptic, let's put it that way. Every other distribution of Linux besides Linux Mint gets it wrong when it comes to these users, when it comes to these new users that come in. Every other distribution, all of you. I'm not really putting you down. It's just a matter of not understanding who your user is. For instance, people go, well, if you're going to use Linux Mint, why don't you just use Ubuntu? There is not an Ubuntu flavor, except for Ubuntu Mate, which has been previously mentioned, that does not require the user to do something that is very Linuxy to get the system working. Straight up Ubuntu, if you install it just the way it is, half of the LibreOffice suite is not installed. Chances are, with straight up Ubuntu, you're going to have to open up a terminal and install something, or edit a file, or change something to make it do what you want it to do. It's not an out-of-the-box experience. It is a very minimal experience. And for people who have a modicum of experience with Linux, they can figure this out. Or if they are in a situation where they have an administrator who is setting all this up for them, then it works great for them. But if you're somebody who's just an old Windows user who's tired of dealing with it, and you want to install Ubuntu, it can be very intimidating. Very intimidating, regardless of what the desktop is, except for Ubuntu Mate. And the reason why Ubuntu Mate is different is because they have their welcome menu. Well, so does Linux Mint. And Linux Mint's welcome menu takes you through the steps of getting started. They have a very well-written guide for somebody who wants to RTFM. You want to read the manual. It's a step-by-step thing. Linux Mint is not perfect, but I can set up Linux Mint without ever opening a terminal. I can tell somebody how to set up Linux Mint on a telephone who is not computer savvy just by saying, follow this step, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've done it many, many, many times. When I used to do one-on-one support, we'd set up Linux Mint. That's what we started with. So for somebody to come along and say that Linux Mint doesn't have a reason to exist, and that they don't see why the distribution should have anybody contributing to it, just shows this profound ignorance. Just a profound ignorance of what it is like to start out with Linux, for if you're not a computer user. If you're not a computer IT person, somebody who is, most everybody's a computer user these days, or at least in some form or fashion. But I mean, you're not a power user. That's what I was trying to say. So if you've been using Linux for 10 or 15 years, then you probably don't get it. And one of the things that was said was that 10 years ago, when Linux Mint was first coming along, that Ubuntu was particularly tricky to set up. That's absolutely true, because you would install Ubuntu, and what would happen is you'd find that you couldn't play a YouTube video at the time. Why? Because you had no Flash player. So then you had to go off and figure out how to do that. So the Linux Mint team, they decided, well, damn the torpedoes. We don't care about the licensing. We don't care if we get sued. We're just going to include this crap. When you install it, there you go. That's how I got started with Linux. I fumbled around with Ubuntu and then installed Linux Mint one day, and damn, everything just worked. Now, I have not run Linux Mint as my main distro all these years. I have gone back to Ubuntu, but Linux Mint was a stepping stone for me, and it's a stepping stone for a lot of other people. You can you can learn your way around Linux in Linux Mint and then move on to whatever distribution you like. That's why it exists. And then there are people like my mom, for instance, who use Linux Mint and love it and don't want to change. Linux Mint is extremely stable. I have had installations of Linux Mint on my own hardware that have run for 5 or 6 years with nothing but regular updates and upgrades. In other words, I didn't reinstall it or anything. I just upgraded in place and kept it going. And it did. So that is one of the things about Linux Mint. It's boring? Yeah. Stable? Hell yeah. Now, there are those in the Linux community who will accuse Linux Mint of being insecure. We need to talk about this right now, because you're going to hear this. Up to the Linux Mint 17 series, it was not automatic for Linux Mint to install a new kernel. Those packages were held back. Even if a revision of the kernel came in that added security or features to the system, Linux Mint would not automatically install that. You would have to do it manually. In the 17 series, they had a kernel tool, so you would have to roll forward manually to do that. Linux Mint caught a lot of hell for that because many people in the Linux community said, hey, that's insecure. You need to update the kernel. But when you look at that, you have to think about the time in which they were doing that. It was during a time, we're talking 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago now, that a kernel update could break your system. It's not even a matter of could it break your system, it was a matter of when it could break your system. Kernel development and the way distributions deal with kernels has improved over the last 5 years like 1,000,000%. And the later versions of Linux Mint, 18 and beyond, you can opt to go ahead and install that new kernel, that new revision of whatever kernel series you're on, because it won't break your system anymore like it used to. But 5 or 10 years ago, it would break your system. That's why the Linux Mint people did what they did. It wasn't because that they didn't understand that it was a security risk. The problem is that people's systems would get broke. They wouldn't know how to roll back. They wouldn't know how to fix it. So they were trying to mitigate that by saying, hey, as long as this particular release is, you can stay on this revision of this kernel. It's a trade-off between security and stability. It always is, ladies and gentlemen. That's the problem with rolling releases. As much as people who like rolling releases want to beat their chest and say, it never breaks on me, sooner or later it will. Because a rolling release simply dumps the latest code out to their users, and if it breaks, it breaks. If you're using something like Ubuntu or Linux Mint or Debian Stable, they don't do that. If there's an update that's made, it's tested. And that makes sure that you can sit down at your computer and fire it up and it'll start working. That's more important than the offhand chance that you might, just maybe, on a desktop Linux system, have somebody exploit some little-known vulnerability in the Linux kernel. People who run servers need to worry about that kind of crap, because on the internet, servers are constantly being banged on. I run servers on the internet, and my servers are always reporting to me, hey, all these people tried to sign into your SSH, and they tried to get in, and they're not authorized. But my Linux machine, which is sitting behind a firewall in my router, that never happens, and it's never going to happen. But Linux Mint did respond to that. New versions of Linux Mint, every time a new kernel comes out, it gets installed. Not an issue anymore. So shut up about it. Now, the other thing about Linux Mint is that about 3 or 4 years ago, I don't remember exactly when this was, what happened to Linux Mint was that a WordPress account was hacked on their webpage. And that WordPress account had a weak password. Somebody got a hold of it, and they exploited that vulnerability by replacing one of the ISO images that was available for download with one that had a little piece of malware in it. This was available for download for about 6 hours on a weekend. So it happened on a Saturday. Okay? When it was discovered, it was immediately pulled down, and the community was notified that this happened. Linux Mint admitted that they had a security issue. They called in security experts to toughen up their site, which they did. Nothing like that has ever happened since. The Linux community as a whole has never forgiven the Linux Mint project for that. Even to this day, you still hear it. Linux Mint is insecure. Linux Mint is poorly coded and it will break your machine and it's horrible Linux and you should never use it. And then they'll point back to that and they'll say, it was hacked. Let me tell you what, a lot of stuff in the Linux world has been hacked. The Ubuntu forums have been hacked several times. But you don't hear people going on and on about that. And this stuff happens, but for some reason, when it happened to Linux Mint, it happened in such a way that people never let it go, and they've held it against the distribution. One of the things that DistroTube talked about was Banshee, how the donate button, which Banshee was a media player, at some point 3 or 4 years ago, there was a donate button in Banshee, and it was accidentally donating to the Mint project itself. I didn't even know about that story. I don't even know what that is. But it was rectified and fixed. Even he pointed that out. So what is the point of dredging that shit up now? Why do we do this in this community? That is ridiculous. Nobody's perfect. Developers are not perfect. They make mistakes. Distributions make mistakes. Come on, folks. It's not fair to piss all over one distribution or another. It simply isn't. It's not. So quit it. And that leads me to my final point, and then I'm going to wrap this thing up. This is clickbait journalism. That's what this is. When you have one person who's sitting behind a keyboard trying to figure out a way to get more people to read their stuff or cause a stink within the tech and Linux community, and they can sit there and put in their headline, Linux Mint, it's time for Linux Mint to go, or even Linux Mint must die. The profound level of disrespect that shows for the open source community as a whole, the principles of open source, and the people who work hard to develop whatever project it is that you happen to be pissing all over at that moment. That is horrible. There are people who work on the Linux Mint project who contribute their time and they get no compensation. One of the things that was said in DistroTube's video was that the LMDE project, Linux Mint on Debian, they had abandoned it and they didn't care. That's not true. We just had a major release of LMDE, which I contributed to. I was a beta tester. I found bugs and gave bug reports to the Mint developers about that. So don't tell me that it wasn't developed, because it was, and it still is, and you can go download it. He made it sound like that the link wasn't on the website anymore. The point of it is that people in the open source world have this technology which is freely available to them. It's free for me to use. It's free for me to develop. It's free for me to use as a springboard to develop my own things. And if you're going to sit there and say a project shouldn't exist, then you're just, wow, that you don't get it, do you? There are plenty of projects out there that I don't use or I don't like. There are distributions of Linux that I don't understand why they exist. I'll give you, for instance, Elementary OS. I don't get it. I've installed it. I've played with it. I've reviewed it. I don't like it. But there are a lot of really nice people working on Elementary OS. Elementary OS caused a stink very early on because they had their webpage set up in such a way that it appeared that you would have to contribute a donation to be able to download. That happened years ago. But I don't hear people railing on elementary OS today about that. I have a reason why I think that happens with Linux Mint. And I'll get into that in just a minute, but let me finish this point. So I don't like elementary OS, but you don't see me getting on this channel and telling people, well, elementary OS should just shut down and go away. No. I mean, I'll give you my honest opinion about it. It ain't my cup of tea, but there are people out there who love elementary OS, who support the project and thinks it's great. That doesn't threaten me if I want to use Ubuntu or Linux Mint. I joke on people in the Arch community. It doesn't threaten me if you want to use Arch Linux. You're not taking away my Ubuntu or my Linux Mint. I never said that Arch Linux should die. It's different strokes for different folks. And it just shows a profound disrespect for the basic principles of open source. You can take this technology and do whatever you want with it as long as you're not breaking the law or hurting somebody. So you have to respect people's choices. That's part of the deal. Now, last thought, and then I'm going to wrap this thing up. Why do I think Linux Mint gets all this negativity? I'll tell you why. Because they absolutely, positively suck at marketing. The Linux Mint project has no clue how to market. None whatsoever. They have no charismatic people in the community espousing the benefits of Linux Mint. Clem Lefebvre, who is the head developer, will not talk to anybody. He doesn't give interviews. He doesn't come on to people's YouTube broadcasts, podcasts, whatever. He won't do it. I've asked. He ignores you completely if you ask. If you send an email to Clem Lefebvre as a creator in the community, as somebody who's working in media, and if you send him an email, it will bounce off. You will not get a response. That's how he deals with it. And that is to the detriment of Linux Mint because they're not marketing themselves and they don't have leaders out in the community talking about themselves. You think about Ubuntu. You think about people like Will Cook and you think about Alan Pope and you think about people like Martin Wimpress. Martin Wimpress and Alan Pope work on Ubuntu Mate and Ubuntu the mainstream as well. And then Will Cook is doing the Ubuntu podcast. He's available. And Joe Resington, who appears on the Ubuntu podcast, and then they go on to like Jupiter Broadcasting shows, and they'll talk to people, and they'll do this and do that. They'll do that, but nobody from Linux Mint will. None of the developers are out in the community. So, Linux Mint, if you're watching this video, contact me, and we will talk about it. I will Google Hangout you or Jitsi you or whatever it is, and I will do a video with you, and I will talk about the wonders of Linux Mint. I will give you as much airtime on this channel as you would like. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Nobody's going to take me up on that. That's the problem with Linux Mint. One of the greatest Linux distributions there is, zero marketing, and they're not talking to the community like that. And that's sad. And that's my opinion. And I'm done with my rant. Links to James Sanders' article and DistroTube's video are in the description for this video, along with a bunch of other links where you can become part of the Easy Linux project in one way or another, or follow me, or whatever you want to do. Go to EzeeLinux.com for more about Linux. That's sort of a clearinghouse for all this stuff. We have Easy Linux on Facebook. Give that a like if you're a Facebook user, and consider becoming a part of the Easy Linux forum, EzeeTalk. It is free, secure, and fun. We have moderators who make sure that everybody has a good time in that forum, and everybody plays nice. So thank you very much for watching the video. I certainly do appreciate it. Cannot wait to hear your feedback on this one. Here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go.